This is the ICS Hi-Capa Challenger. It is a new gun on the market from ICS, who is not that well known for making gas blowback pistols. They got a few, but they're a little bit more esoteric things like licensed Korth replica, a licensed SAR-9 replica. This is their first hi-capa, at least that I'm aware of. Really their first gas blowback pistol on sort of a major platform, you know, the hi-capa, Glock, what have you. And it's a really interesting offering. And there's a lot of positive stuff about this and a lot of really nice features. There's a few things I don't like as well, and I'll go over that. This has been available for about a month in Taiwan. I think that nowhere else is it available. Hong Kong, I believe, has some around. It's not available overseas. I think that actually they had a delay. I'll go into this a little bit in detail, but looks like the initial Magwell they sent out with it was actually had a little bit of issues and could not be used with TM mags despite this being marketed as TM compatible. However, they've since fixed that. They actually sent out new Magwells to all the people in Taiwan, and I'm guessing probably the remanufacturing and fixing that issue delayed their overseas rollout. But these should be coming out soon, and I see on YouTube that there's more and more reviews of this popping up from YouTubers that seem to have gotten them from ICS for review copies. This, however, I bought with my own money. I am able and free to be fully honest with all the positive and negative things I feel about it. So I want to take you through what I think about the gun. I also want to go into a little bit of specifics and come at it from the angle of looking at this as a potential base gun for custom hi-capas, because that's a big part of the market actually. A lot of people get TM hi-capas and they're good guns by themselves. You know, I have plenty. You know, I got my gold match here, which is going to become a custom gun later. I got my 4.3, going to become a custom gun later. I got this started as a 5.1, and I've since changed around a lot of different stuff. This is what people tend to do for custom hi-capas. They take a TM base gun and modify it, which is funny in a sense because the TM 5.1 came out about 18 years ago. And it's funny that in the market, nobody has really come and been able to rival that. A lot of that just comes down to ultimately, of course, TMs have good quality, but then you basically need to replace the slide for longevity with green gas because it is a plastic slide. It will eventually probably break. You can run this for a long time actually with green gas, depending upon some circumstances, but it'll probably eventually wear down and break. It has good quality overall, and you know the material is relatively cheap. You know, these are casting parts and things. The casting is well done and it works well and the internals are good. But the big thing about this is just that the aftermarket for hi-capas is almost all specifically for TM hi-capas. And if you use WE or AW or any of the many other hi-capa brands or versions out there, you're going to run into some problems with fitment, such and so on. So still, the standard is, even after all these years, grab a TM hi-capa and use that as a base for your customs. Finally, we're going to be getting some stuff. It looks like recently this came out. I know Lancer actually came out with a TM compatible hi-capa. We may be getting some more stuff as well. It looks like potentially we may have some more options as bases for hi-capas. And this is certainly one potentially good option. And I'll go through the ups and downs of that in this video. So that being said, let me take you a little bit over my impression of the base gun and the ups and downs of what I think about it. And then I'll also go through the specifics of the good parts I think about this, and then a few of the bad things I think about it, or things that are maybe not so good, depending upon your opinions and your perspective. So my overall impression about this gun is that it's overall very good, and it has an interesting niche. Whether that niche is good for you or not may be up to sort of personal opinion. The big thing about this gun, and one of its big selling points, is that it's able to lift very heavy BBs because it has a TDC hop-up chamber. And I'll go into a little bit more later. But basically, the point is that you're able to take this gun and out of the box, it can lift heavy BBs, which generally speaking, the heavier the BB, the more accurate it is at range. And then you also have a out of the box red dot mount. So you're able to go and take this gun and out of the box, theoretically, go and shoot accurately at long range. The base gun lets you go and use it almost as a target pistol. It's a little bit of an interesting niche in a sense because, strictly speaking, if you're doing sort of an open gun or you're doing competitive shooting, a slide mounted optic is not the best. It adds reciprocating weight to the slide. It makes the slide cycle faster. It makes the recoil a bit heavier, which of course the airsoft recoil isn't that big in the first place, but it is a non-zero factor. And then typically people who have open style guns will have a frame mounted optic mount, which comes up above here and leaves the slide to be light and fast cycling. For people who are like speed QB type players or want to do more speed soft and want the really fast cycling hi-capa, they want to HPA, they want to basically use their hi-capa as a short, high capacity weapon and also get that consistency from HPA and such and so on. It's also maybe not the best because you need to replace the slide in the first place. So one of the big selling points of the base gun, kind of for two of the major niches for hi-capas, which is stuff like competitive stuff where you have open style guns, the other stuff is things for like speed soft style, is kind of gets rid of the main selling point of the base gun, which is this nice slide with a red dot mount and the ability to loft heavy BBs. So I would say that the niche it meets that niche and meets the needs of that well, but it's a kind of specific niche. Somebody who wants sort of duty gun style characteristics, but at the same time doesn't need it to be actually like a military style gun, like a actual Glock, because this is actually set up to be really a sports style gun, if you will. It's marked 38 Super. 38 Super is a caliber that's most common in competitive shooting. So clearly they had that in mind, I think, as they were making this, but it is interesting. It's interesting that the combination of features. But long story short is that it works very well. It's accurate. It has a bunch of positive features. It has a red dot out of the sight. So the base gun itself, I think, is really good. I'm not going to bore you with shooting into a chrono box for 10 minutes and letting you see the various speeds, the various weights. It shoots very well. It's a well-made gun. I will link down in the description some videos who did go through and shot into the chrono box with different weight BBs, and you can see exactly how it performs with that and with some different magazines, such and so on. So you'll get to see that, but I don't want to spend your time doing that. I want to focus more in upon some specific features to discuss here. Of course, as we're going through this and going through essentially the value proposition of this gun, both as a base gun and also as its potential as a custom gun, what comes up is, of course, price. And price is a little bit hard to lock down when it comes to things like TMs. TMs, for those who don't know, Tokyo Marui guns, they aren't sold directly overseas, which is to say that Tokyo Marui, the company itself, doesn't just sell these directly overseas. It almost always goes through intermediaries. So frequently be something like they sell it to a company in Japan, a distributor, and then the distributor in Japan is probably exporting maybe directly to a store, maybe to a distributor within another country, and then that distributor then in turn goes to a local brick and mortar store, maybe directly to a online store, what have you. Basically what happens is that these pass through a couple hands on their way to get into people's hands in other countries, and each step there of course takes a little bit of a margin. So where you have something like the Gold Match 4.3, I actually don't have a fully stocked 5.1 on hand at the moment, but these in Japan, they will be almost, it varies upon the market and varies from time to time, but on Amazon, you can usually get these for like $110 US. And then they'll be significantly more overseas. Sometimes, you see these gold matches, 180, 200 US dollars, such and so on. So keeping that in mind, what's the price of this? This is in Taiwan right now, it's 4,850 Taiwanese dollars, which is about a 170 US dollars. As of course the base gun, this is my own red dot sight that is obviously not included in the gun. It's, I think, a perfectly fair price. It puts it about the same or a little bit cheaper as a gold match here in Taiwan, and I think that comparison may be around the same. So a little bit more than the base 5.1 TM hi-capa in most places, but then not quite as much as the gold match. But then depending upon your market, this may end up being significantly cheaper. Right now, there's a store in Hong Kong also that has them for 200 US dollars. So there's going to be some variation. I know in Japan, they were going for about 25,000 yen, which is about 220, 30 US dollars, I want to say. So depends upon the market. This will be more expensive someplace. We'll see how the market comes and if this comes up or down. But keep in mind, this is probably going to be a little bit more expensive than TM 5.1 as we go along. I do think the features justify this if you're using it for a base gun. So keep that in mind as well. So having talked about what I think of this as a base gun and also the price, generally speaking, what the price should be around, though there will be some variation from market to market, I want to go through and hit on the specific parts of this gun that I think are good and some of the ones that I think are not as good, and you can look at that and consider how that might impact your using this as a base gun for a custom gun. So first off is the metal slide. I'm going to take off the red dot here for a bit. I had that on so you can look at the gun how it's kind of supposed to be with the red dot on it. But now, of course, we want to see it and look at it as it would come out of the box, aka without a red dot. So I call this a positive, is that it has a nice metal slide. You may or may not like the aesthetics of it. You see here there's a scallop cut, kind of reminiscent of a Desert Eagle almost. As well, you have some lightning cuts on the top. You have your red dot mount here as well. Very good to have this on a base gun, but then also at the same time, if you're using a base gun, you may want to swap the slide anyway. So this may or may not matter to you. The other problem here is that if you don't want to use, for example, a red dot, say you do want to keep this and you want to swap around some other stuff, you want to keep the slide. If you don't have a red dot, it looks pretty, frankly, ugly in my mind without a red dot. I think with a red dot, it looks good. I think without a red dot, having this big flat surface here does not look so great. You can take this off, and I'll show you in a moment what it looks like when you take it off and set it up for a normal sight, but then it also doesn't come with normal sights. So that is one potential downside. The RMR, it's not just an RMR, but it's also a DOC mount, which is great to have more options there. Unfortunately, this is quite shallow holes, and a lot of the screws that come with various optics, you may actually need to get shorter screws in order to properly use them because these are so shallow. Even the ones I have right now barely work, but you'll be able to see later, actually, I'm drilling into the metal of the slide a little bit, which is not perfect. The other thing nice about this, while we're talking about the slide, which in a sense it's an aluminum slide, you know what it is, it's good. I will also say that it has the sight here, also has a hammer pad, which we'll look at in a little bit detail in a moment, which is nice to have out the box, and indeed is probably basically a requirement because you have these steel hammer, which would otherwise probably start tearing up your slide pretty fast. While we're talking about the slide as well, it's worth noting, I'll go in the outer barrel. I don't like the outer barrel very much. I'll go into that a little bit more detail later. It has interesting thing here where the muzzle opening here is actually a little bit ovular, and then it scoops down a little bit here. It's not as sharp as, for example, an AM slide here. So you see the AM slide here has a bit more sharp edge here, whereas this is actually rounded off. A little bit hard to see in this light maybe, but it's more rounded off. And the nice thing about that is you can see here on the AM slide here, let's get some more light on this. On the AM slide here, you can see here where it's sharp here, it's also gotten worn down. This is because they used a steel barrel on this, so the aluminum of the slide gets worn down. If you use an aluminum barrel, the other thing could happen, and then this part will start to wear down your aluminum barrel because it's oftentimes a little bit less hard or around the same hardness. So your aluminum barrel tends to get the bad side of that wear. So it's nice that they actually have this slight little thing here where it is a bit ovular and it's a bit more rounded off. Unfortunately, you have this outer barrel here, which is kind of swimming in it, but we'll go into that a little bit later. So I've taken off the red dot sight here, and you can see this is what the slide looks like without it. As mentioned, because there's so little room here, this is really quite shallow here. The red dot screws that I've tried out have all been on the long side and digging into the metal a little bit. I find I'm still able to use them. I've seen some other people who've had this slide and they can't even use the screws they came with. So you may have to source some screws besides the ones that come with your sight to use this properly. As you can see here, we have a hammer pad, and the hammer pad is screwed into the top sight here, which it is nice to have, though I will go into a little bit some details about the negatives of this hammer pad later on in my negatives section. Next good thing is that it has, of course, this hop-up unit, which it says Tokyo Marui spec only. And this is a, we'll see how well you can see this. Probably not that well, but you may notice that there's not really the nub you usually see at the top of a hi-capa barrel. And that is because this is an R hop. You'll also see that it's a TDC hop. What a TDC hop is this is a normal hop-up. This is a stock TM hop-up. And you can see here, there is this metal arm here that comes in and grips it like this, and then this is where it presses down, and on the bucking, you see here, you can stick it up at the top, and then you adjust that with this guy to go up and down and adjust how much that nub is sticking out and how much hop up you get. This is a TDC hop and is theoretically at least much better. Obviously for lighter BBs, the standard hop up is pretty good, but then with heavier BBs, this may not have enough strength. There may be too much flex in the hop up unit there. So what this is instead of having this kind of L-shaped thing that's here and has this potential for flex, it has a whole O-shaped thing, and then the top of it comes down and pressures it evenly along sort of a curvature there. So you can see here, you can see just barely there's a little bit coming over the top. Theoretically, this provides a more even and consistent hop up, and is what a lot of people like. There's lots of people that do TDC modifications on various pistols now, things like the SOCOM Mark 23 and such. People really love to put their TDC hops on and thinks it is the best thing. So looking inside this real briefly, you'll see how it is. You have, hopefully I'm not going to screw anything up here. It's a little bit more complicated than other hop-ups in a sense, but you can see here how you have this O-shaped guy, and then it goes and presses down, and theoretically this will be much more stable. This comes with a R-hop like this, where the point of an R-hop is it doesn't stick out so much. It only hits a bit of the BB and makes it get backspin and hop up through that. It recommends out of the box that for this hop up, you will use 0.3 or heavier BBs, so it's really intended for heavy BBs. It also has a separate hop up, which I believe has a smaller window here in case you need to use smaller than 0.3 BBs. Though I haven't tested out this one yet. I've just been using the heavier BBs, which is fine since I tend to use 0.3 tracers for most of my skirmishing anyway. So here you can see the difference the TDC hop is. And I think that's insofar as I know, this is the first company that's done this out of the box. And I think it's definitely a good change. It is a little bit of a pain because the hop is adjusted via screwing into this from the bottom. You can see here. So you need to take a little hex wrench that they include and screw it up into here, and that's how you adjust the hop, and that brings that up and down. It's a little bit more involved than just the wheel at the bottom on most hop-ups, but at the same time, this should be quite solid and shouldn't move around at all. So once you have it set in for a given BB weight, it should basically be set. Next good thing about the ICS Challenger is that this is an advanced style frame, which is very nice. Typically, advanced style frames, you don't get that often in stock guns. In fact, I'm not sure if any other gun I'm aware of that has an advanced frame stock. There may be some, but none that I've used. An advanced frame essentially is primarily two things. One, it has the full rail here. So compare that to, for example, a gold match frame I have here. You see there's the railing here is interrupted. It has some at the front and it has some at the back. The gold match as well also has less of an overhang here than the normal frame. In normal 5.1s, this is basically mirrored on the other side here. A little bit different from the gold match, but you can see here that the frame is interrupted there. Whereas with the ICS, you have the full frame, which is nice, or the full railings for the frame rather, which is very nice. Theoretically, you get smoother action there because you're less likely to have any movement around side to side. Practically, I've never noticed a difference per se, but it is good to have nonetheless. It's also an advanced frame in that the hammer group here and all the internals are in a separate little unit here that you can pull out. With a TM style frame, what actually happens when you disassemble it is you have to take out this whole part. You take off this whole half of the frame, and this, as you see here, is stuck on the frame more or less. It's a little bit different. Functionally, it's a bit nicer to have this, I think, in my mind, because you don't have to take the whole side off the frame, and it's a little bit annoying. I do prefer this style, but it's also functionally not a huge difference. The other thing on the frame, of course, is you have these nice rails on the front. In addition to the rails, you have this nice little feature here, which is a grub screw. What this does is this actually allows you to tension the hop. Let's see if you can see. Yeah, you can kind of see here, see right here, how that's sticking up a tiny bit. That's because I have this up. You can screw this in and out like that, and then it will go down below or up above. This allows you to actually tension the hop ever so slightly. Without the outer barrel and all that other stuff, what your hop up looks like sitting here is like this. And you're gonna see, actually, I'm gonna have to push this in a little bit hard. I'm gonna have to push this in a little bit harder than you usually do, which is actually good to a certain extent. And typically one thing that causes inaccuracy in the gun is this moving around a bunch. And what this does is this allows you to add a little bit more height, or height above, or bring it down below a little bit if you want to for whatever reason. Keeping in mind that this, your pivot point basically for your hop up is going to be where you lock it in with your slide release. So if you push that grub screw up a little bit, it's going to keep the barrel down a bit. If you push it If you put the grub screw down, it's going to push the barrel up a bit, but it will be more consistent either way. And a lot of people, when they do custom hi-capas, if they're really dialing in the accuracy, what they'll do is they'll shim that part so you get less vertical movement here. But this already has an easy way of doing it included in the frame, which I've never seen in another frame. Maybe some frames somewhere have that, but I've never noticed that. And I think that that is a nice tiny little change. This is actually really good. And moreover, I haven't seen them mention that anywhere in their sort of copy, which I think is actually something that for people who like to dial in the accuracy of their hi-capas is potentially a very good thing. You do have to keep in mind, however, that if you push this up or down, depending upon the details, you may also be pushing your upper barrel up or down. You might be rubbing against your slide. You need to be aware of a few different factors of this, but having it is basically a good thing. The other part here, as we're talking about the frame and the internals here, is that all these internals are steel, which is an upgrade from TM stuff. TM stuff is certainly good quality and is well made for what it is, but the material itself is cheap. And then for these, I'm not sure. In Japan, typically you can't really have much in the way of steel parts. There's limits to the hardness, I believe, for some parts, but there may be some details there. So they may or may not be allowed to actually have the steel parts for the Japan version of this gun, because they are selling this in Japan just with a plastic slide. But at least for the overseas versions, for sure, you're getting these nice steel parts. Insofar as how good the internals are, that takes more time to see. Whether or not they wear down more or the specific very small dimensions is something that will take a little bit more time. It's hard for me to tell immediately in a review like this. But keep in mind, you have good quality internals there. The BBU, I think, is also quite good. It has some attractive features here. For example, just the nozzle return spring here has a little metal piece, makes it slightly, just adds a little bit of weight and makes it slightly less prone to popping out and flying away, which is nice. It also gives a nice purchase here over there. I will not be able to move this without the thing popping out, but let's see here. Yeah, let's take it out here. The head popped out because there's no screw here holding it in, but the head actually has has the piston head and actually has another O-ring down here, which is good. I don't know exactly how useful that will be practically or meaningfully, but it is nice in that theoretically, instead of having this one point, usually if you just have a piston head or just one O-ring, like on the, for example, AM style BBUs, you have only one point of contact with the nozzle, and theoretically that could cause it to move around back and forth ever so slightly. Theoretically with this, you should have it making sure that it's a bit more stable, or having 2 points of contact, if you will. Practically how much that matters, I don't know, but it's nice to see something that should theoretically be good. Let me get this back in place here like that. There we go. Also, it's kind of nice having an orange color. Not a big deal, but it's a little something to differentiate it. This is mostly out of zinc. This middle part, I believe, is about aluminum. So because it has a combination of zinc and aluminum, it's ever so slightly less heavy than the stock TM BBUs, but it is not quite as light as an AM all aluminum CNC one. No surprise there. The guide rod it comes with is, I believe, steel. It also comes with a little washer and a little rubber buffer to reduce the impact of the recoil. And it is good to have that because the recoil is a bit on the heavy side due to the heavier slide. And then if you have a red dot on the top, it's even heavier. Steel is actually quite nice. I have actually had cases where the newer TM guide rods, for example, on the Gold Match and the 4.3, they're like this as well, where they have this part here, this metal here is a little bit thinner. Whereas in the original TM 5.1, it's a bit on the thicker side, but it doesn't have a buffer. So these have a buffer, and then it's a little bit thinner here on the TM because they're not made of steel, they're made of zinc, I believe. I've actually had these break on me because it's just not quite as strong and it wears down over time. With steel, you shouldn't really have to worry about that. A little bit heavier maybe than, for example, aluminum obviously is a little bit heavier then, but it is nice to have steel parts out of the box. Then of course you have this whole part. You have a out of the box Magwell, which is very nice. As mentioned before, they initially sent you here in Taiwan with a Magwell that unfortunately didn't work with TM mags. You can see here how this is ever so slightly thicker than this one over here. That was kind of the design error, I think. Also perhaps at the front and back. Here at the front, it's very hard to see. There's a little bit of an indent here, whereas this is straight. So this one, I think, between the combination of the thickness on the side and some of the stuff on the front there, probably was just ever so slightly too big to fit TM mags, which is very unfortunate. and was, I think, a mistake on their part, and they immediately fixed it. So all the overseas ones should have the newer Magwell and should be able to run TM mags mostly. The grip here, I think, is also quite nice quality. You may or may not like the aesthetics of it and the grippiness of it. It is more slick than some, but it looks almost like sort of an aluminum style grip. I feel like I've seen aluminum grips that are like this. It's made to, I think, a good high quality. You can see here there's the mold lines, some slight mold lines on it, but it is certainly not a big deal. I actually found that this is so nicely fitted here that, you know, when you're taking apart your gun and you have to hold this up so that the hammer spring doesn't push it down, I actually found that I didn't even need to hold this on because it's so nicely fitted here, which is nice to see. So I think there's some good stuff going on. It's also, all the grips are serialized. So this is G, and then I believe the 07 is for July, and then 2021, and then gun number 29. So presumably this is gun number 29 they made fairly early along in the production. I've seen other reviews where they had gun number, I think, 28 and gun number 21 at another one. So these are all sort of the early Taiwan batch. It is nice to have that little serialization so you know where and when this gun was made, sort of. So that was me going over quickly all of these stuff that I like about the gun and I think are the good things. Next, I'm going to go over the stuff that I don't like so much about the gun. And there are a few things. I think overall it's a very attractive package. I think it has a lot of potential. But there are a few things where I kind of question the decisions they made about it, and I don't like it so much. First off, let's look at the outer barrel here. So this outer barrel, I am not too much of a fan of. So first off, it's a fixed outer barrel. As you can see here, it doesn't drop, but it's so loose that it almost feels like not like a dropping outer barrel, like a non-fixed outer barrel. Compare that, for example, to this is a stock TM outer barrel, which is plastic and dropping. And you see here, this is what a dropping barrel looks like. It's up here, and then as the gun recoils, it drops down, kind of a mimicking of the actual 1911 action in a real firearm, but doesn't have much purpose in airsoft because you're not actually using the locking lugs. So most guns, people tend to change them to fixed barrels after it for theoretically improved accuracy and such, but this is so... It's so loose, it just feels bad. I also don't like, to be honest, I don't like the finish of it. I also think that the 38 Super Game Changer, I don't know, like, it's purely subjective, but the Game Changer is a bit cheesy. I don't really like to have that on my gun. Altogether, it is not the best of outer barrels in my mind. It's also very loose here in the gun, as you can see here. Because this is about something like, I think it's about 17.3 millimeters if you get at the widest point, if you measure the widest point. And then the slide is the typical 18.1 millimeters across here. So if you take like a normal, this is just a 5KU steel outer barrel I have on hand. Normal barrels, more normal barrels fit normally. As I noticed before, this has it's a bit ovular, and then you have more room down here, and then a rounded off edge here. So the good side of this is that it will be good with aluminum outer barrels. Theoretically, there's a little bit less chance wear here, especially if you dial in that grub screw to make sure that your inner is keeping this up a bit so you're not scratching on the bottom too much. But the stock outer barrel is not so good in my mind, so I'm not a fan of that. Also, aesthetically, I think that, and the glossy black on black, it's okay, but I'm not a huge fan. I also found that it's already starting to wear quite a bit. So the dimensions wise, however, it's matching is that it's hitting these locking lugs here. And this does have locking lugs on this slide, by the way, which I don't think they needed. This is an AM slide, for example, which AM has this thing here, which isn't like kind of maybe one locking lug, if you consider it. I'm not sure about every single AM slide, but the ones I'm aware of, I believe, don't have locking lugs as I recall. Locking lugs, they don't serve a purpose in airsoft, and I kind of wish that people would do away with them, especially because your stock gun here, at least for Tokyo Marui and stuff, your stock gun actually has a dropping barrel, and the locking lugs kind of function in a sense. They don't actually have a actual function that's critical to the gun, but at least the locking lugs actually lock in and then unlock as the gun cycles and so on. But for this, you really don't need locking lugs, and they just seem to cause wear on the outer barrel and don't really seem to have a purpose. So I kind of wish they had gone without the locking lugs. Maybe they needed to have those to keep the stiffness of this or improve the stiffness somewhat. I don't know. I wouldn't think it would matter that much. I think it's just there because stock slides have locking lugs, so they put it on. So some minor negative stuff here with locking lugs and then the size of the outer barrel, but a lot of people are going to change the outer barrel anyway. Aside from the size of the outer barrel, the threading is 11 millimeter counterclockwise. That's right, 11 millimeter counterclockwise. Basically everything you have in airsoft where you have 11 millimeter, you have 11 millimeter clockwise, you see here. I'm not sure exactly why they did this. What I presume is that probably what they wanted to do was take, for example, you have a 14 millimeter tracer or barrel attachment. You screw it in. Once you get down here, you can just screw it in. And this is the X-Cortex. It's a little bit short here, so you see more. So you see some extra of the threading, but that's just the problem with X-Cortex, not the problem with the barrel here. Whereas with other stuff, because it's 11 millimeter counterclockwise and then 14 millimeter clockwise, you screw this in, and then once you get to a certain point, you start unscrewing the other side, which is what I think they were trying to avoid by having this unique threading. But you know what? Every single tracer basically comes with one of these adapters, and you can stick in a hex wrench or something and just tighten it down with the O-rings, and then it's really never a problem. So I feel like they made a unique threading here for no real good purpose, or to fix an issue, if you will, with something that's already fixed by an attachment that comes in basically every single tracer's box in the first place. So I'm not a fan of this. So between the size stuff and then the abnormal threading, I would say get rid of the outer barrel. But then of course, a lot of people for base guns are going to get rid of the outer barrel in the first place. My next gripe here is about the controls. I'm overall not a fan of the controls. Trigger with its adjustment screw, or rather set screw for over travel, is nice. But then the finish on the controls is this glossy stuff, and I think that it does not look particularly good. It also feels really slick. So it's really slippery, and it's across all this. The mag release I don't like too much as well. The texturing there and such. It's worst probably on the slide catch here. The slide catch, and this actually came like this. It came scratched. That might have been from the retailer I bought it from. Maybe took it out for some photos and ended up like that. It's maybe a little bit hard to see, but you can maybe see here how there's actually bubbling. So the finish is a bit thick, too thick, and there's some bubbling there. The finish is also a bit too thick where you see here in this sort of texture, the serrations or what have you. It's okay, but over here it kind of got messed up where it kind of bubbled up and there's too much and it kind of messed with the serrations. So between the serrations, there's gummed up sort of finish however they use this. And I'm not sure if every gun is like this, or if it was just mine being an early gun had a little bit of an issue, or if it just passed QC when it shouldn't have, or such and so on. But a little bit of a thing to watch out for. Not the end of the world per se, but I don't like it. The other thing is the finish wears off pretty fast. Of course, this is an internal part here. This is the slide catch. This kind of inherently gets a bunch of wear because you have your hop up there and such and so on. And it's given to wear, but even then this shows that it is going to wear off, and you can see here it's starting to wear. And because this finish is so different from the original color of the metal parts, it does stick out when that sort of thick finish comes off. Compare that, for example, to 4.3, where even where it wears, the color is not as different. So, you see various amounts of wear here, but it's kind of okay. The other thing is because it doesn't have the thick finish, the serrations here are much sharper and it feels much more grippy, which I really quite like to have on my controls. I don't like it to be too slick. It feels kind of bad. And also being glossy, I think it looks a bit cheap and plasticky. So that's one kind of downside to this. Insofar as using this as a base gun, it really depends upon whether this aesthetically goes against it. A more neutral color like these are quite inoffensive. The base TM ones, they'll work on basically any build. You have the black of the frame and stuff anyway, so and it's matching that. Whereas these might kind of clash with whatever color scheme you've got. So it's something to keep in mind. The other problem, of course, with the base gun is that replacing these with like nice AM parts or the steel parts, there's some cheap ones around probably, but the nice ones of these, of all the rear safety and the manual safety, those are expensive. You will spend, like, depending upon the market, even Hong Kong prices, it's $60 to $80 for these probably. So overseas, you might be spending like 80 USD equivalent up to 100 USD equivalent, like just for this one part, for example, for a nice one. There's some cheaper ones around, but it's important to keep in mind kind of that if you really don't like the aesthetics of this may kill the use of the gun for you as a base gun in the first place, just because the aesthetics are kind of meh. The other thing I don't like about this is that the manual safety here is, I've actually already swapped out the spring here for a harder one, so it's a little bit better. But the spring that came with this was quite on the soft side, and I found that my safety would pop up really easily. So with your safety here, what you're doing is, let's see if we can get good light on it. See here you have a plunger, and then look at the shape of that. It goes down and it holds in place here, and when you take it off, it goes to a certain point, and then once it's to a certain point, boom, and that will basically, the spring there will basically pop it up once you get past that certain point and it's swooping down. What happens here is I found that the spring it comes with was very weak, and I think that combined with the slick texture of it made this really easy to pop up. So I had a friend here and I gave it to him to test out, and he found that it popped up accidentally on him because he runs it like this.
Oh, this fucking safety, man.
The other problem is, though, that a lot of people, they like to run their hi-capa and they'll have a thumbs up grip where you have your thumb resting on your safety like this. In fact, some people make special safeties with like a wall here so you can have it very high and not have your thumb rubbing against the slide here. But a lot of people, myself included, kind of like to run it like this. If you like to run it like this, this safety is too small. This is a gold match, but the standard TM 5.1 is also the size. It's too small and feels a bit weird, and I don't get very good purchase on it. And then if you like to run your thumbs below, because of that safety being so like slick and easy to pop up, you might accidentally pop on your safety in the middle of a game. So kind of negatives for both these things. I'm not a big fan of the controls across a bunch of different factors. Usability, also the finish, and aesthetics. So the controls are one of the big downsides for me for this gun specifically. Next little gripe about this is to do with the sights. And I got a few things here. One is that this hammer pad is super soft. It's good to have a hammer pad. I'm glad they have a hammer pad. You don't usually get a hammer pad. You basically need to have a hammer pad given that it is a steel hammer and steel internals there. But I found that I haven't even run this all that much, and this is really soft. It's almost getting to the point where I'm hitting the screw as is. This isn't that surprising. I'm pretty sure that this is cast aluminum, as I believe most of the aluminum parts here. I don't think they've done CNC for anything because it's too expensive for a mass-produced gun like this. But there's a reason that hammer pads like this are often made of 7075 aluminum. 7075 aluminum, for example, AIP hammer pads are 7075 aluminum. 7075 aluminum, you kind of have to CNC it, and it's very hard and kind of a pain in the ass to work with a number of ways, but it's about twice as hard as other types of aluminum, but not as hard as steel. So you still get the desired thing where you have the steel wearing down the disposable hammer pad, but then for 7075 it'll last for a bit longer. The problem with this is that I've only skirmished with this like a few times. Gave it to a friend to skirmish with. I've done a bunch of test firing and stuff and so on, but I've got maybe 2,000 rounds through this, not too much, and it's already going pretty far. And in fact, in order to disassemble and get the BBU out, I actually had to go and break off some aluminum that had been pushed down over where the screw goes here. If I can find that screw. It had been so much, and this does happen, but it had been so much and so quite quickly where it already deformed this metal to the point that it was covering the screw, and I had to break it off to get it out there. So quite soft. And then and one of the problems is that small parts like this can sometimes be difficult to replace, especially if they're not available freely. So I would recommend maybe swapping this out as soon as you can if you want to use a hammer pad, and you probably do want to use a hammer pad with a steel hammer. The other thing is that because the hammer pad is screwed in here, it's nice that it's screwed in here, and it's kind of a one unit with this, and it should help make it more stable. And you have these, you have this, so you have this screw in here and this screw in here, and should make the red dot plate quite stable. The downside, of course, is that if you have the hammer pad and you want to swap slides and wanted to use the hammer pad, you really can't, because this screw-in point means that it will not work with other normal rear sights, be it on this slide or if you're swapping slides. Speaking of which, as long as we're on the rear sights, so this is what the slide looks like with the pad to allow you to use normal TM 5.1 rear sights. I mean, it works. It's not that great. For whatever reason, this pad also has little like dents here from the machining. Just think how the metal is cast probably is not quite as clean as it should be, but that is what it is. But then of course it doesn't come with a rear sight, which if you're using this as a base gun, you have to keep in mind that if you're using this as a base gun, typically if you're doing a cheap build with a base gun, you can take the base gun and then you can basically just swap the slide and everything else will work. The front sight on some TMs is not going to work that well with metal slides. You may have to replace your front sight, but you can usually use your rear sight, which is nice because rear sights, this is serviceable, and then rear sights a bit on the expensive side usually. But for this, if you're going to use it as a base gun and swap the slide, you will need to buy a rear sight with it. Unfortunately, you can't even go kind of no rear sight because your rear sight is also required to screw in and hold in your BBU here. So one thing to keep in mind is if you're getting this with a base gun, one downside is you will also at the same time have to price in a rear sight, which a lot of people will do anyway because they want to get a nice rear sight. But in case you're making sort of a budget build, there's some limits there. This is another really, really minor gripe, which is so minor I almost don't even want to mention it. But I did notice while I was messing around with it that there's cases where this is TM spec and then it's supposed to be everything matches TM. But in reality, every little tiny part, and there's so many ways that you can have things off by 0.1 millimeter in these guns that something will not quite work. I did find, for example, that this, and you can probably barely even see it, but you'll see this isn't quite round here in the hole here. The reason for that is because it doesn't quite match. This is an AM Infinity Magwell, which is of course TM spec. Let me just go and shove it in. Yeah, I can't even shove in this pin here because it doesn't quite match. And it's probably just something up at the front here. But long story short, sort of, there's probably some very, very minor differences. This is a stock TM grip. Probably some very minor differences in width or something somewhere causes this to not quite fit some stuff that's supposed to fit. So this is kind of like, this is using a specific example of an AM Magwell that is TM stock and fits perfectly with TM plastic grips. But it's worth keeping in mind that you're never necessarily quite 100% free from the chance of fitment. Even with TMs, of course, aftermarket parts occasionally need fitment. But it's good to keep in mind that sometimes you will have stuff that doesn't work perfectly as well here because so much stuff is made with TM in mind. And even though this is TM compatible and truly is essentially in every way TM compatible, there may be some small stuff. So keep that in mind. If you were, for example, a really new builder and you really don't know how or what to file down to get things to fit, you may have a little bit more trouble with this, ever so slightly much more trouble with this, as opposed to a TM where these days the aftermarket's so good that typically most stuff, if you buy high quality things, really is kind of drop in. So that was a relatively quick go through just of all the parts of the ICS Challenger that I think are of interest to people, specifically with regards to using this as a base gun for custom hi-capas and all the stuff that you need to sort of consider. For me personally, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to run this for a while and get some more time behind the trigger with this. With this, I've swapped out that outer barrel, which I said I really don't like, and I've swapped in a relatively cheap 5KU Tornado barrel, which I think having a little bit of silver there to offset all the black on this really makes it look a bit better, and also lets me use normal sort of 11 millimeter tracers and adapters for that. So typically how I've been running this is with 0.30 gram tracer BBs and running it with a tracer on the front of sorts. And I've noticed it is quite nice. The red dot lets me get some good hits at good distance and stay behind cover and really just snipe people with it. And I find that it works quite well and is quite nice. I'm also at the same time going to go a bit of the polar opposite, and I've got a slide here. I need to get a new nozzle because my nozzle actually just broke on this. But I'm going to do the polar opposite and use this as a base gun and have a mega slide here for some really fast, snappy action. And one thing that I consider, because this stock slide is so nice and has, you know, a red dot mount and such, and has such nice features. I'm kind of considering using this more and maybe swapping around some stuff, maybe swapping around these controls and stuff because I don't like them that much, but then keeping it basically as a 2-type gun where I have a speedy slide like this, if you will, but I also have a slide where I can do some more kind of realistic single shot sniping with a slide mounted optic, if you will. It's definitely something to consider, I think, is because the slide here is generally so nice and has a good, nice function, but also may not be what you want aesthetically for your build, but it feels kind of a waste to throw it away. You might want to consider just having this as a backup slide or for certain purposes, or if you want to use it sometimes, and then build it up elsewise as you want to make your custom gun look like exactly. So overall, really good effort by ICS. I think there's a lot of useful stuff here, specifically having all this in one package at the same price, again, in most markets, not necessarily every market, but the same price as a TM Gold Match is very good. It's got some nice features. It has an advanced frame. It has that grub screw there, TDC R-hop, comes with a red dot mount, really, really nice. And of course, steel hammer and such, really, really nice option to have. Whether or not this will become a go-to, I think probably won't necessarily become a go-to. Having to buy a rear sight if you're going to swap slides. Also, people just kind of feeling like it's a waste to get a gun with a nicer slide like this and then not use it at all may prevent people from getting this. They may still, of course, go with the old 5.1 stock gun as their base gun. But this will be, I think, a strong contender in the future as a potential base gun for custom hi-capas, especially because you have all these nice features. And then really, the only difficulties here are sort of aesthetic. If they may come up with another version of this with better controls, I would say maybe this is the new go-to, and I would basically never use TM hi-capas again. But a couple of small kind of aesthetic gripes I have prevent me from saying this is now the new go-to. All right, thanks for watching. If you disagree with some stuff that I said, and certainly a lot of this is kind of me riffing and giving my initial impressions, I haven't fully tested every aspect of this. There may be some positive and negatives that I'll find out more as I use this more. If you have opinions about it, leave me a comment. And of course, subscribe is always welcome. Thanks very much.